The map was printed in 1783, and by all accounts of modern history, it shouldn't exist. My finger traced the borders of a region larger than Russia, larger than the United States sprawled across. Heart of Northern Asia with a name that has been surgically excised from the modern mind. Tartaria. There were no nomadic tents or empty wastelands depicted here. Instead, there were cities, trade routes, and a sophisticated political infrastructure that simply vanished. This wasn't a clerical error, it was a crime scene. Someone decided what we are allowed to remember. I'm not talking about the natural fading of time. I'm talking about a coordinated, multi-generational architecture of forgetting. The deeper I looked into the gaps, the silences, and the stories that vanish without explanation, the more I realized we aren't dealing with accidents. We are dealing with design, a secret society of sorts, not one with robes and rituals, but one built on banking ledgers. Publishing houses and educational boards erased a civilization to ensure you would never know what humanity was truly capable of. Someone chose what stays and what disappears, and the deeper I looked into the gaps, the silences, the deliberate omissions, the stories that vanish without explanation, the more I realized. We're not dealing with accidents. We're dealing with architecture, the architecture of forgetting. This investigation began with Tartaria, yes, but it didn't end there. It couldn't, because once you start pulling at that particular thread, the entire tapestry begins to unravel. What I found wasn't just the erasure of one civilization or one empire. What I found was a pattern, a methodology, a system, so vast and so coordinated that it suggests something most people refuse to consider. That our understanding of history isn't incomplete by accident, it's incomplete by design. There's an organization behind this, a network, a hidden architecture of power that operates through banking systems, through publishing houses, through educational institutions, through the very mechanisms we trust to tell us the truth. They don't wear uniforms. They don't announce themselves, but they're there in the gaps, in the silences, in the perfectly coordinated erasure of knowledge across continents and centuries. And what they've hidden isn't just history, it's power itself, the power that comes from knowing. Humanity once knew, the technologies we once possessed, the wisdom we once practiced. All of it systematically removed from our collective consciousness, leaving us weaker, more manageable, more dependent on the systems they control. This is their story, or rather the story of what they don't want you to know. Let me start with what made me suspicious in the first place. It wasn't the buildings. Everyone talks about the buildings. The impossible architecture, the advanced techniques, the symmetry and scale that seem beyond the capabilities of the supposed era. But that's not what caught my attention initially. It was the silence, the deafening coordinated silence across every major historical institution simultaneously. Here's what I mean. Pick any major civilization from recorded history: Egypt, Rome, Greece, Persia, Mongolia. You can find thousands of primary sources, documents, letters, administrative records, tax ledgers, personal diaries, court proceedings. The mundane machinery of civilization leaves traces everywhere, mountains of traces. But with Tartaria, nothing. Not nothing in the sense of not much, nothing in the sense of systematic absence. Maps show it, encyclopedias mention it, geographic references span centuries. And then suddenly, around the mid-1800s, it all stops. Not gradually, not with a slow fade as empires do, but with surgical precision. The official explanation, it was just a geographic term, a vague reference to unclaimed territories, nothing more. The official explanation collapses here because geographic terms don't require systematic removal from maps, encyclopedias, and historical records across multiple nations, already languages and continents. Geographic terms don't necessitate the rewriting of history textbooks in France, England, Russia, America, and Germany within the same narrow time window. Geographic terms don't spark coordinated silence among institutions that otherwise competed with each other fiercely. This raises a simple but critical question. Who coordinated that silence? I started looking at banking networks, not modern banks, though they're part of this. I started looking at the financial architecture that emerged. During the same period, the historical record was being rewritten. The 1800s, the century of consolidation. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Major banking families began consolidating power. Across Europe in the late 1700s and early 1800s, they didn't just lend money, they controlled currencies. They financed wars on both sides. They built networks that transcended national boundaries. Networks that made nations themselves seem almost quaint by comparison. And here's where it gets interesting. These networks didn't just finance governments. They financed education. They financed publishing. They became the invisible hand behind the institutions that decided what history meant, what truth was, what knowledge could be taught. This wasn't charity. This was control. When you control the mechanisms that produce knowledge, you control knowledge itself. When you control knowledge, you control how people understand their world, their potential, their limitations. You control what they believe is possible. The deeper I went, the more I found the same names, appearing in the most unexpected places. Banking families financing archaeological expeditions. Banking families endowing university chairs in history and anthropology. Banking families establishing publishing houses that would go on to produce the definitive textbooks of their era. Not suspicious in isolation, but taken together with the timing, with the systematic erasure happening simultaneously. The evidence suggests something much larger. Let me give you a specific example. The Encyclopedia Britannica, in its early editions 1771, 1797, 1810, Tartary appears extensively. It's described as a vast region, sometimes an empire with detailed maps showing its extent across northern Asia. The entry is substantial, detailed, matter of fact. By the late 1800s, reduced, minimized, reframed as mere geography. By the mid-1900s, nearly absent. Now, you might say that's just scholarly refinement, better information, updated research. But here's the problem. Better information doesn't erase. It adds context, it complicates, it nuances. What happened to Tartarian encyclopedias isn't refinement, it's removal. And it happened across every major encyclopedia. Simultaneously, British, French, German, American, Russian. This raises the question, who had the influence to coordinate that? Individual editors make individual choices. But when dozens of editors across multiple countries and competing publishers all make the same choice, in the same historical window, that's not coincidence, that's coordination. And that coordination requires infrastructure. I started digging into the publishing networks of the 1800s. Who owned what? Who financed whom? Who sat on which boards? And that's when the names started appearing again. The same banking families, the same financial networks, not always directly, often through intermediaries, through foundations, through trusts, designed to obscure the connections. But the connections were there. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Publishing is one thing, but education is where the real power lies. Think about how history is taught, not what is taught, how. Through standardized curricula, through approved textbooks, through teacher training programs that enforce methodological uniformity, through accreditation systems that punish deviation. The system seems neutral, objective, scientific even, but neutrality is itself a choice, and that choice serves someone. Here's what I found. The same period that saw the erasure of Tartary from encyclopedias also saw the standardization of history education across Western nations. This wasn't organic, it was engineered. Foundations established by banking and industrial families began funding educational reform movements. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, they funded the creation of standardized curricula. They funded teacher training programs. They funded research into scientific education methods. Why would bankers care about how history is taught? The official answer, civic duty, philanthropy, improving society. The evidence suggests otherwise. When you examine what these educational reforms actually accomplished, a pattern emerges. They didn't expand historical knowledge. They narrowed it. They didn't encourage critical thinking about historical narratives. They enforced acceptance of approved narratives. They created a system where questioning the official story became professionally dangerous for teachers and academically punishing for students, not through overt censorship, through structure, through standards, through the subtle but pervasive pressure to conform. And that's where this becomes impossible to ignore, because the knowledge that disappeared during this period wasn't random. It was scattered, it was specific. Knowledge about alternative power systems, knowledge about decentralized civilizations, knowledge about technologies that didn't require industrial infrastructure, knowledge about ways of organizing society that didn't concentrate power in the hands of financial and industrial elites. Gone, all of it systematically removed. From textbooks, from curricula, from the approved narrative. Why? This is where the conspiracy deepens. into something almost unbelievable. Almost. The buildings everyone focuses on. The so-called World's Fair structures, the civic buildings, the cathedrals and infrastructure that appear suddenly in the historical record without adequate documentation of their construction. These weren't just aesthetically advanced, they were technologically advanced. I'm not talking about aesthetics. I'm talking about acoustic design, energy systems, heating and cooling mechanisms that didn't require fossil fuels, water management systems that operated without electric pumps, architectural knowledge that modern engineers struggled to replicate, even with contemporary tools. And here's the strangest part. This technology didn't evolve. According to the official narrative, it just appeared, fully formed, implemented across continents, within narrow time windows. Then just as suddenly it disappeared, replaced by inferior systems that required centralized power, centralized control, and most importantly, centralized profit. The pattern is obvious once you look for it. Advanced decentralized technology gets replaced by primitive centralized technology. The primitive technology requires infrastructure. Infrastructure requires capital. Capital requires banks. Banks require control, and control requires ignorance. If people knew what was possible, if they understood the technological capabilities that once existed, they might ask uncomfortable questions. They might wonder why we abandoned superior systems. They might recognize that our progress represents in some ways a regression designed to increase dependence on centralized power structures. So the knowledge had to go, not just the knowledge of Tartary, Surmari, the knowledge of what human civilization was capable of achieving outside the industrial financial paradigm. The silence was deafening. Let me walk you through how this actually works, how you erase a civilization from collective memory without anyone noticing. First, you control the sources. You buy libraries, you fund archaeological expeditions, you acquire private collections. You don't destroy them, that's too obvious. You classify them, you restrict access. You place them in institutions where only approved researchers with approved methodologies can study them. And you make sure those researchers understand what conclusions are acceptable. Second, you control the interpretation. You establish the frameworks through which evidence must be understood. You create academic departments that enforce methodological orthodoxy. You ensure that anyone who deviates faces professional consequences, not censorship. That would be too crude. Just the quiet denial of tenure, the rejection of grant applications, the exclusion from prestigious journals. Third, you control the narrative. You fund the publishing houses, you endow the university chairs. You create the appearance of independent scholarship while ensuring that all roads lead to approved conclusions. Fourth, you wait because the most powerful form of control is the one people don't notice. Within a generation, the new narrative becomes the only narrative. The alternative explanations fade from memory. The questions stop being asked, and anyone who does ask gets dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, a crank. This isn't speculation. This is documented. You can trace the funding networks. You can map the institutional connections. Now we need to talk about the actual structure of this organization because it's not what you'd expect. It's not a secret society with robes and rituals. It's something more mundane and more powerful. They operate through foundations, trusts, interlocking corporate boards, cultural institutions. They don't meet in shadowy rooms to plot history's erasure. They don't need to. The structure itself ensures coordination without requiring explicit conspiracy. How? Through aligned incentives. When the same families fund universities, publishing school, museums, and research institutions, when they sit on boards that oversee all these entities, when they establish the grant-making criteria, they don't need to issue directives. The system naturally produces the outcomes they desire. Researchers learn what gets funded. Publishers learn what sells. Educators learn what's acceptable. And slowly, imperceptibly, the boundaries of acceptable discourse narrow, not through censorship, but through the subtle architecture of incentive. And that's where Tartaria becomes important again. Not because Tartaria itself was some great empire. Tartaria matters because its erasure demonstrates the system's capabilities. If they could remove an entire civilization, the answer, I think, lies in what Tartaria represented or what it might have represented. An alternative model. A person in the 1800s looking into a handheld device that shows a map of a different world, light reflecting in eyes. If they recognize that the story of progress we've been sold is actually a story of consolidation and control, they might start imagining alternatives. and alternatives are the enemy of monopoly. This is about power in its purest form. Economic power, the power that comes from controlling the systems, energy systems, financial systems, information systems. If humanity understood its own history, we might recognize that we're more capable than we've been led to believe, that the systems presented as necessary are actually optional. Knowledge is power, and the inverse is equally true. Ignorance is control. The erasure of Tartaria wasn't about hiding one empire. It was about hiding possibility itself. I reached out to several academic historians. The responses were telling. They followed an identical template. They suggested I was pursuing a conspiracy theory. They recommended I stick to reputable sources. The system had trained them so effectively that they couldn't see the gaps in their own explanations. That's the real genius of this control structure. It doesn't require conspirators. It requires a methodology that becomes invisible to those who practice it. Now we get to what might be the most important part. What was actually lost? Not just the history of one empire, knowledge itself, practical knowledge, technological knowledge, wisdom about how to build civilizations that didn't depend on centralized control and extraction. The buildings everyone fixates on their symptoms, not the disease. Yes, they suggest architectural capabilities. The threat is what those buildings represent, the possibility of technological sophistication without industrial capitalism. Why would the erasure coincide so perfectly with the rise of the banking and industrial families? But when you look at what we actually lost, you have to ask better for whom. The greatest heist in human history wasn't of gold or territory, it was of possibility itself. The heist is nearly complete, but nearly isn't completely. Some remember, some question. And that might be enough, because once you understand the system, you can start to resist it. The investigation continues. The questions remain. The silence speaks volumes, and somewhere in the shadows, the truth still waits.